Happy holidays from the Behind the Bells podcast.
Marker. And action.
This is Behind the Bells, the show that takes you behind the magic of your favorite Christmas movies and shows. Within the background of every Santa Claus, reindeer, and stocking is a story. Where did it come from? Our Christmas movie expert will unravel all of that and give you the full story. Sit back and enjoy another episode with Robert Nicholas.
Merry Monday, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Bells. I'm your host, Robert Nicholas, and I'll be taking you on another one-horse open sleigh ride into the world of Christmas movies. So for today's episode, I thought I'd try something a little different. Rather than part 2 of Krampus, which is coming by the way, I thought I'd try to do the first of what I'm hoping will be many of Editorial episodes. I'm sure you're wondering, what is an editorial episode? Well, an editorial episode is going to not necessarily deep dive into something's history, but rather just give off my own personal thoughts and opinions on a certain special, or maybe even a movie. So, for the first ever, I thought I'd tackle something that I am actually fully versed in. It's time to talk about Nickelodeon. Having grown up in the 1990s, Nickelodeon certainly played a big part into my passion of both movies and television shows. Nickelodeon happened to be one of the very first channels to ever have the look that was designed by kids for kids. Hence, not just the shows themselves were, well, kid-friendly, but even the commercials that were tied in were sort of meant to look like as if they were produced by kids. Now, having said that, a good chunk of the shows that aired during that time were all really good. So, throughout the month of December, every other week, I thought I would look into a different Nicktoon or Nickelodeon show that happened to have a Christmas special. So, why don't we start off by talking about Doug. Now, Doug was something of a 1990s version of Peanuts. Unlike Ren and Stimpy, which was just, well, animation chaos, or Rugrats, which, yeah, had its realistic moments, still allowed its animation to tell the stories of its more bombastic adventures of the babies, Doug had always meant to be more of a slice-of-life kind of show. Because, yeah, you'd still get your fair share of large-scale adventures. Most of them existed, well, all in the mind of Doug Funny, an 11-year-old who had just happened to move from Bloatsburg to Bluffington. In fact, the pilot episode is probably the best way to introduce yourself to everyone else. Doug and his family move to 21 Jumbo Street, where they meet all kinds of characters, including their neighbor, Mr. Dink, Doug's new best friend, Skeeter, his nemesis, Roger, and, of course, Doug's crush, Patty Mayonnaise. Doug himself wasn't necessarily a popular kid, or even that smart. If anything, the show flat out admits that Doug himself was a bit naive and a bit of a wimp. But to their credit, a lot of kids at 11 happen to be wimpy and naive. I just so happened to be one of those guys myself. I wasn't popular either, nor was I really the best student. But like Doug, I did manage to pick myself back up every now and then, and keep trying. So, most of the stories on Doug really revolved around similar issues people would have in real life. Trying to find a new barber, getting addicted to a new video game rather than doing schoolwork, drawing a doodle and accidentally having it sent to your teacher, or even just creating your own comic and placing your own friends and family within those situations just to see what would happen. So yeah, even though it doesn't sound that exciting, Doug itself was a very popular show, managing to run for 3 seasons on Nickelodeon. But just to give a little context, The show was created by Jim Jenkins, who based a lot of the events on Doug on his own childhood and his own hometown of Richmond, Virginia. It aired around Nickelodeon around 1991 on the exact same day that both Rugrats and Ren and Stimpy aired. Apparently, Nickelodeon had expected Doug to become the big hit, completely unaware of the draw that Rugrats was going to have. Now, I'm assuming that because of the fact that the show focused on more of its slice-of-life elements rather than the fantasy, that was probably what made Rugrats much more popular than Doug. Now, personally, in my book, I was always more of a Doug fan than a Rugrats fan, simply because I could relate to these characters a lot, even though at the time I was only 6, 7, or 8 during the time when I saw the show. Now, what's also kind of unique about Doug in this situation is that it's the only cartoon I'm aware of that went from Nickelodeon to Disney. Because at some point after the show's initial ending on Nickelodeon, Jim Jenkins was allowed to shop it around elsewhere, and Disney showed interest, and after making a brand new deal, a brand new revival of Doug got to air on ABC as a part of their One Saturday Morning segment. Now, that show also ran about 3 seasons, though to be honest, I did not watch that much of that show either. It was clear that the show had to make a lot of changes in order to really differentiate itself from the Nickelodeon show. The problem was, I think a lot of the writing had really suffered, with a lot of the more, I don't want to say fantasy elements coming out, but let's just say that the slice-of-life elements just weren't as relatable anymore. And I don't know if the show got different writers or whatnot, or a different production crew, but something about it always felt very off. And from what I understand, actor Billy West, who played Doug for the longest time, declined to reprise his role on the TV show as well. But regardless, what do both shows have in common? Well, they both had their own Christmas specials that, oddly enough, one is better than the other, and it's actually not what you would think. I'm sure a lot of people are expecting me to praise the Nickelodeon one over the Doug one. Now, if you were to ask me about the TV show, you'd be right. I would declare the Nickelodeon one way better than the Disney one. But if we were going to talk about the Christmas specials, well, hands down, the Disney special is miles better. Now, I'll get to that one in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the Nickelodeon Christmas special, Doug's Christmas Story. I first saw the special sometime in the mid-90s when it was airing as a rerun, part of Nickelodeon's Christmas specials lineup. And, well, I was shocked by how much of a downer and how dark this special really was. So, what is the story exactly? Well, things begin innocently enough with Doug and his friends all playing a game of ice hockey on top of Lucky Duck Lake just a few days before the season begins. Now, Doug's dog, Pork Chop, who also happens to be one of those, well, smarter than the average bear type of dogs, if you know what I mean, happens to come across thin ice when the pine cone they're playing with scuttles over there. Now, one of Doug's friends, BB, who also happens to be one of the wealthiest kids around, hurries over there to try to get it for some reason, can't see the thin ice cracks around the area as much as Pork Chop keeps trying to block her from doing so. Finally, to prevent her from falling in, Pork Chop makes the sudden decision to bite her and drag her away. Now, I'm sure there could have been a few other solutions to really get her attention, or somehow get her eyes checked because she couldn't look 10 feet in front of her. But even though she's safe, Pork Chop isn't. Everybody starts talking about how Pork Chop may have, bitten her or attacked her or so, which, of course, shocks Doug to the core. Of course, they all go home later on, and Doug scolds Pork Chop, but really isn't sure exactly what happened, only other than getting the notice that several people saw him bite her. But while Doug and his sister Judy are away at the mall, somehow word gets out to not the mayor, but ex-mayor Bob White. At least I thought that was his name, but anyway, the former mayor now has his own radio show where, upon getting a caller in which they describe the whole dog attack, he decides to use this whole momentum, as a brand new press face just for himself. By the time Doug comes home, he already sees that Pork Chop is being hauled away by the pound, along with a whole bunch of press cameras that are there that are all congratulating the ex-mayor for taking care of the really dangerous dog situation. And not just that, but within a few minutes later, Doug then gets the notice that the Bluff family are about to press charges to potentially put down Pork Chop. Now, this of course brings Doug to an absolute shock because along with being one of his best friends, Pork Chop himself was also a Christmas gift to Doug when he was a lot younger. So his parents suggest the idea of trying to get the public side on them by going and getting a bunch of signatures for a petition. And even though Doug does manage to get a signature for Mr. Dink, it seems that the whole town either happens to be on the Bluff side or just doesn't care because it's the holiday season.
It started out great, but then...
No, I don't want to be mixed up in this mess.
But... now he wants to put my dog to sleep.
Your dog, Doug? They can't do that.
Then you'll sign?
Sure.
Honey, that's the dog on the news.
Oh, sorry.
This is Christmas. It's no time for petitions and legal business. It's time for presents and cookies and strudel and...
But Mrs. Spindle...
This is supposed to be a happy time. This is not happy. Save it for after the holiday.
But by then, it'll be too late.
You should have thought of that before.
So Doug at this point decides to simply try breaking out Pork Chop from the whole pound area. But that doesn't go well, but especially after a, quote-unquote, cupcake smoke bomb goes off a little too soon. And even though Doug does manage to get the Pork Chop, he's captured and thrown out of the place before he can help his poor doggy escape. Doug then contemplates a few other plans, but all I can think about are his memories with Pork Chop and what happens to be one of the darkest images that I've honestly seen in any kind of kid-centered special. Doug imagines a future where he's visiting Pork Chop's grave, and on top of that, we even see Doug cry, which I really don't recall that many other moments, if ever, when Doug actually broke out in tears on the show. We eventually cut to the court trial, which happens on Christmas Eve, by the way, where not only does the Bluff family go all in on their prosecution and defense to try to prove that Pork Chop himself was a bad dog. Now, before I continue on, I should probably talk about BB's dad, Bill Bluff, who as I said, happens to be the richest man in town, who at one point even decides to go after Pork Chop earlier in the episode, all simply because dogs have no money and provide no use. I mean, I don't really get this motivation either, but you kind of have to go with the whole show flow here. But eventually, Doug is able to sway the town into at least going to the lake just to see exactly what happened. And what has to be one of the more odder moments, even though the whole town is completely against this dog, Pork Chop, all Doug had to do was get up and mention a few things like, who was there to babysit your kids, or who was there to help build your house? Yeah, apparently it's one of those kinds of towns where it operates on a sudden mood swing of stupidity, where they suddenly hate everybody but then love everybody on the drop of a dime. Somehow the judge agrees to go to the lake, to which then again BB starts retracing her steps and once again heads over towards the thin ice, which, along with her not seeing it, nobody else in town happens to see any of the cracks. And of course Pork Chop does try to run for help, but this time he's on a leash and can't do anything. Well, surprise, surprise, BB falls in. And of course, amongst the shock and horror, Pork Chop does somehow manage to get off his leash and dive in and save her. Now, I am glad that Pork Chop did get his redemption moment, but let's be honest, with ice that thin and apparently everybody blind to any kind of cracks in the ice, it was bound to happen sooner than later, so to be fair, this episode might have saved a lot of time had they just let BB fall through the ice the first time around and then let Porkchop rescue her then. That would have made him a hero right away. Now, one of the reasons that this episode worked for me for a while was simply because I've always wanted to see Doug doing a holiday special of some sort. After all, Rugrats got one, Rocko's Modern Life got one, Ren and Stimpy got one, so I think it was just more or less just seeing Doug do a holiday special brought me a lot of joy. Now, watching it again as an adult, I was surprised by how much I really didn't care for this special. And as I've said, a lot of it is because it is a bit of a downer. Because, yeah, the idea of trying to save your dog from being gassed to death only around Christmas time is pretty sad and pretty depressing. But more importantly, the show really doesn't focus that much on Doug this time around. A lot of it's on Porkchop. And don't get me wrong, Porkchop's a cute dog, but I don't know if necessarily Doug learned anything from the whole experience. The only one who does manage to learn a lesson is Bill Bluff, who, again, on the swing of a dime, or the drop of a dime, if you want to call it that, he then drops his hatred for dogs, suddenly loving dogs, and manages to, well, find homes for all the pound dogs, all within the course of 5 hours. It's clearly one of those stories that, maybe with a little more time could have fleshed out some of the other characters, especially Doug's point of view, and maybe even the family members' point of view, because after all, his mom and dad and sister have all been around Porkchop too, so you'd think that they would have chimed in on their own defense, themselves trying to help out Porkchop, but nope. It seems that Doug's the only one who's willing to do anything. Hell, not even any of his friends like Skeeter, Patty, or even Roger step in at any point to really defend Porkchop, even though that dog's hung around with him in every other episode. Man, it's one of those. It's just one of those shows that I can't even imagine modern kids really getting into. If anything, you're better off just watching the old Doug show, just any episode other than the Christmas special. And plus, to top it off, you think that the Christmas special would at least have a Christmassy kind of feel, but not really. Maybe at the most, you'll see some of the houses from the show have on their Christmas lights with a wreath and a tree on the inside. But the most noticeable thing that at least made it a little more Christmassy was oddly the soundtrack, which, let's talk about the soundtrack for Doug. The show itself more or less relied on kind of a beatbox kind of mentality, one of those something kind of like that for a good chunk of its music. And it certainly doesn't disappoint when it does bring in its fair share of Christmas beatbox music. It does cater to Doug pretty well, especially around the holiday season, but it's far from saving us from such a dreary story. And, well, I guess you could call it a dilemma, because maybe I should be more grateful for the fact that we do have a dog story that shows how much a dog can be a family member itself. But the story just feels way too condensed. It feels rushed at the same time. And if anything, it feels like a script that needed at least 5 more rewrites, or maybe even a different Christmas special to actually focus on Doug this time. I will quickly note the one joke I actually did get a good laugh at, and it goes back to that cupcake smoke bomb that I mentioned earlier, which again makes no sense, and itself isn't funny, but when we do go right to the pound, where Doug and Skeeter go to the pound to try to get Porkchop out, there's a big old sign that actually reads, "No cupcakes allowed," which, that was just so random of a fact that I couldn't help but giggle a little bit, so there's at least one joke that works out fine. So the good news is, we do have another special that does focus on Doug as a character. A Christmas special, in fact. So, with that being said, let's jump over to the Disney special and see what's different here.
And now back to the show with our Christmas movie expert, Robert Nicholas.
On the Disney side of things, we have a different story called Doug's Secret Christmas. Now, I saw this one for the first time, not on TV, but rather through a VHS recording. You see, sometime in either the mid or late 90s, Disney was running some kind of Christmas in July marathon that actually was replaying several other Disney shows via the Christmas stuff, just as a fun way to do something Christmassy during the summertime. And one of them did happen to be Doug's Secret Christmas. Now, even though I personally didn't have time to sit down and watch it, I did ask my parents to try to find it and record it, and kudos for them for really finding out when it was going to air. Now, again, I bet you're thinking that with the way the Disney show, wrote some of its characters and redesigned everything, I wouldn't really like this whole one. But at the short end of it, I actually really like this special a lot better. In fact, just to give you an idea on how much more Christmassy this feels, let's talk about the beginning of it, which itself is a recreation of Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. We get a whole redesign of Bluffington and Doug Street, as if it looks much more Seuss-like and something out of Whoville. There's even a Boris Karloff-sounding narrator who starts speaking in rhyme as Roger Klotz suddenly comes in as a Grinch-like figure into Doug's house to try to steal the Christmas stuff, only to find that everything else is already gone. All the Christmassy stuff is off the walls and there's just nothing to be had. And as Roger Klotz's Grinch is just looking around wondering what the heck, we then cut to Doug as another Grinch who managed to beat Roger to the punch. And I'll say up front that the animation style did a really good job recreating the Chuck Jones style. And it's even a pretty good way to get you into the Christmas spirit, before the special starts. But once we cut away to the actual episode itself, we then find that it's only a couple of days before Christmas. About a week, I think, since we're cutting to the tree lighting ceremony, which in any other town in America probably would be happening at around Thanksgiving or close to Thanksgiving, while in Doug's town of Bluffington, it oddly happens just 1 week before everything happens. Who knows, but regardless, it still feels nice and Christmassy. And then Doug in his journal sort of recreates just what kind of traditions his family goes through, including on how the 20th they put up the tree, which, let's be honest, is way too late to actually go to a tree lot and get a tree from there. 21st, they get their lights up, which, again, most people, including myself, get their Christmas lights up way earlier, even before Thanksgiving. And then so on and so forth. Doug's also marked down the end of school, when they get their stockings up, when they go to their grandma's house for Christmas Eve, and of course, Christmas Day itself. Now, the only difference in this year's Christmas for Doug happens to be not with himself, but with his mom, who happens to be close to around 8.5 months pregnant with a brand new child coming in. And even though Doug is ready to hand over his Christmas list to his dad, he gets the sad notice from him that due with the baby coming, Santa wasn't going to have time for presents this year. Now, I will quickly note that just before his dad tells him that notice, let's talk about one of the odder moments of that episode where Doug actually utters the word sex on the show. Yeah, it sounds weird that they would do that on a Disney show, but I guess this was some kind of reoccurring joke, at least during this whole time period where the mom was pregnant and Doug's dad, Phil, was trying to describe the whole birds and the bees scenario to his son, only to find out that by the time he finally is ready to tell him about what happens, Doug already explains that he pretty much knows what goes on. In fact, I'll play a little audio clip here right now of exactly what was said.
Oh, so all that talk about fish and vampires and the internal combustion engine, you really wanted to talk to me about sex?
Oh, yes.
I learned all that stuff in school.
You did?
Yeah, sure.
I know, it was kind of weird and uncomfortable, and from what I understand, Disney would every now and then cut that part out during the re-airings. But if you do watch the episode on Disney Plus, the whole segment is completely uncut. So good luck to the parents that have got to explain that whole scenario. But anyway, as we move on and throughout the whole episode, Doug is kind of concerned that his Christmas may not be the exact same. It doesn't help that come December 22nd, December 20th, Doug goes to the tree lot to, start eyeing out some of the stuff that the family should get. But upon coming home, his parents had already bought one of those faux trees, and not even one of the good ones, but one of those tabletop trees. All because of the fact that they decided to go something a lot small that year. Which disappoints Doug, but he's still willing to really go on with it just for the sake of his family. Yeah, as things go on further and further, we do cut to the occasional B story that's at the school where another student that's with Doug every now and then named Fentruck, who happens to be, a foreign exchange student from a fictional country named Yakistonia, which I can only guess might be in Eastern Europe somewhere. But the whole side plot involves Fentruck confusing American traditions, especially Christmas time, around his own, because apparently in his own country, Christmas is Halloween, where apparently it's tradition on Christmas in Yakistonia to wear costumes, go door to door shouting trick or treat, and get candy. That's pretty much the basis of it, and it'll occasionally cut to Roger, who then complains, "It's not Christmas, it's Halloween." But again, that story really doesn't go anywhere other than an occasional side joke, so let's skip over that. By the time Christmas Eve does come around, Doug does manage to get his present out to Patty, which to his credit is actually very sweet. A homemade pair of earrings that do look like little ears themselves. But the happiness is cut short when he goes back home, only to find that they're not going to Grandma's for Christmas Eve. And even more so, the house still happens to have a lack of Christmas anything, because even the Christmas tree really isn't being done. The Christmas tree really wasn't even it wasn't even done yet at that point, but that's pretty much the basis. No wreaths, no lights, no Christmas dinner of any kind, nothing. It is kind of weird that the family decided not to really do anything, and I will say this, originally as a kid, the part of me that actually did think that Doug was selfish, until I really thought about just how kids probably would be disappointed that absolutely nothing would be done around the holidays. And while I certainly would understand that for a married couple that's got a brand new baby on the way very soon, they wouldn't want to do something as elaborate. But you think they actually would consider, some of the needs of what Doug and Judy would want, and they'd at least want to do something, anything. I mean, they do happen to do something later on, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It's at that point on Christmas Eve that with the lack of Christmas feeling around, Doug does manage to decide that he's just going to have his own little Christmas celebration in his room. So he does manage to get a real tree, certainly not a 6-footer, but more of like a 2-footer from that same tree lot. To its credit, actually it would be a nice thing to have if you had like an apartment situation. But come Christmas Day, Doug and his dog Pork Chop do manage to have a nice little gift-giving ceremony where they sort of sit around and listen to Christmas music. But that's also pretty short-lived when Doug finally decides to go see where his family is. But as soon as he goes around room to room just to see what's happening, nobody's there. Not his parents, not his sister. But just as Doug is wondering exactly where is everyone, he gets the phone call from his dad that they're at the hospital. It turned out that in the middle of the night, his mom had gone into labor, and somehow they would have forgotten. They did forget Doug going out, which is one of the few things I will criticize the episode over. The fact that during the chaos that they would forget one of their own children left at home. I mean, I certainly wouldn't do that to my own kid in that sort of case. But regardless, as soon as Doug manages to make it over to the hospital, he finally meets his brand new baby sister, Cleopatra Dirt Bike Funny. And yeah, that is a joke that's drawn from earlier, but I'll get to that. 2 days later, on December 27th, by the time the family is able to finally go home, they do manage to have a postponed Christmas party, inviting the town and Doug's friends, and Doug does manage to learn his lesson that it's not really traditions that really make the Christmas season. It's his family and exactly what kind of traditions are created on the spot. Which, of course, does lead to Doug suggesting the idea of them having a baby every year, cue the pillow throw to his face. Now, overall, you think that that the Nickelodeon one would be better? But not only do I find this special much better written with even a few more jokes that I actually got a lot of laughs at, this really was a story that did surround around Doug and his dilemma on what Christmas means to him. And I really appreciate that fact that the Disney crew at least took the time to really put the focus on Doug. And the more I thought about it, the special itself also felt a lot Christmas, or even more Christmas than usual. Because along with the Grinch opening, the episode itself actually does pay a lot of tribute to several classic holiday jingles that will play in a Doug-like version within the background, including Comfort and Joy, Jingle Bells, Deck the Halls, all that other good jazz. And plus, the colors in the special just really brighten up around the holidays for some reason. I don't know if it was a different crew that animated it this time, but something about it just felt much more warm than the Nickelodeon special. So, with that being said, this is a special that I actually would recommend over the others. That is, if you did grow up on Doug or any other 90s cartoons. I think a lot of newcomers coming in on this day and age would find the cartoon kind of slow and passé. So I guess it would depend on how old you are trying to get into this whole show. But if you feel like you're the right age, go for the Disney version Christmas special over the Nickelodeon special, even though I will highlight that the Nickelodeon series was still the better written one. But before I move on, I'll just highlight a few jokes that I actually did like. One involving a whole there's a whole fantasy that Doug goes through where he imagines his home life special, or his whole home Christmas, becoming a TV special, including a singer on ice that happens to start singing your typical Christmas schmaltzy song. Another one involves his neighbor, Mr. Dink, who's trying to get out his major Christmas display, but for the life of him cannot get his Santa Claus to say ho ho ho. He'll get one saying hardy har har, or blah blah blah, or one that I actually got a pretty good laugh at, hubba hubba hubba. But yeah, it is weird to say that I laughed more during the Disney special than I did the Nickelodeon special, but it just so happens that this special just got a lot more out of me to really talk about. I do recommend this special if you are a Doug fan, especially the Nickelodeon Doug fan. Especially if you are a Nickelodeon fan, I actually do think that this special would be the more satisfying holiday special. I won't try to make any claims that Doug's one of the greatest shows of all time, or is even really that good on Nickelodeon or on Disney. But it is something I am still going to look back with fond memories. It is still a fun time capsule to look at every now and then. The Christmas specials, as I said, the one on Nickelodeon, not so good. I'd say C-, D+. But the Disney version, I'd give that one much more of a solid B. Which is funny because as a kid, that one I initially would have given something like a C. But maybe there is something of value out of Doug that does make me appreciate it a lot more as an adult. Perhaps at some point, I just may sit down and stream the entirety of both the Nickelodeon and the Disney show once more. So I guess at some point, I'm gonna have to jot that down in my notes somewhere in my iPhone, like, Dear Journal, hi, It's me, Robert. Today, you should probably start watching more Disney's Doug or Nickelodeon's Doug, or any kind of Doug for that matter. Sincerely, Robert. But yeah, I really hope you all enjoyed this kind of editorial episode content. Please let me know what you think of it on my social media platform of any kind. I'd love to know whether or not you thought this was good, this is bad, but it's something I'm testing the grounds of to try to get more episodes out, maybe even meet my goal of doing it daily as I originally promised on my show's intro and outro. But otherwise, we will be going back to a more behind-the-scenes, in-depth perspective next week. Is it going to be Krampus Part 2? Probably not, but for December, I do have something special planned. You're just going to have to wait and see what it is. Until then, see you next week.
Thank you for joining us on this sleigh ride into the magical world of Christmas movies. Check us out for weekly rides into your favorite Christmas classics and their histories. Be sure to give us a positive review on iTunes if you like what you heard. And don't forget to follow us on social media on Facebook and Instagram for updates and special news. Consider subscribing on Patreon in order to help keep the show going and to gain access to some special gifts not available to the public. Merry Monday to all, and to all a good night. See you next week.
Cut. Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.